Hi, I'm Margaret Waterbury. I am the editor-in-chief of Distiller Magazine, and today I'm talking with Scott Thomas Anderson, who's a journalist based in Sacramento who writes for Distiller and is a longtime crime reporter, about his latest story for Distiller, which is about how dark histories drive tourism for two distilleries in the American South.
So it's funny, this particular story is interesting too because a lot of my normie friends really like this story. Like non-spirits people were really I shared it on my own social media and got a lot of really great feedback from just regular people who read my Sacramento News and Review type of stories. So
Totally, and I kind of liked it. I mean, when you pitched it, I was like, "Oh, this is like a Scott crossover story where there's
Um,
like crime and drinking."
yeah, I
Uh,
said that on the social media post, like
yeah,
worlds colliding. Yeah.
yes, yeah. How did you get kind of plugged into how did you get turned on to this story? How did you get connected to these folks?
Well, I first became aware of Stony Bird, who the other subject in the story, through In the Red Clay. So that's a really great audio documentary series in podcast form. And at the very end of it, when it opens, Sean Kipe, the reporter and producer, met him as he was building the distillery. That's when they met. And that's mentioned in the story. So that was Sean's first introduction to Stony, as Stoney's was putting that first distillery in Winder, Georgia together. As Stoney always says, his family did whiskey making in the woods for all that time, but this was going to be their first actual distillery, legal, as he stresses. So I thought that was interesting. And then when the series was over, they did a bonus episode, and Stoney and his son talked about how people were coming to the distillery from all over the world to meet him. And they mentioned, they were selling a lot of whiskey. So that
Mhm.
really got my attention. But I knew the story would have a lot more legs if we could find another similar type of tale with the distillery, different, something that was different but still along those lines of tapping history and tapping kind of a dark history of a place to get people interested in a distillery. And I had just finished a profile on Southern Distilling Company. I'd been out in North Carolina working on that, and in doing research out there, I became aware of the whiskey prison, and I did more research on that, and I had some email exchanges with the owner and founding distiller. He seemed really interesting, and I thought what he was doing was really interesting. And then in terms of trying to get a gauge on how that was resonating with visitors without having been there yet, I looked at online reviews, and the online reviews were through the roof. People loved the whiskey prison. And it was very clear from the reviews that he was getting people coming through the doors that were not necessarily distilled spirits fans or connoisseurs. They were just really interested in history, in touring an old historic prison. But the tour ends in the tasting room, so they were getting exposed to the actual whiskey he was making.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting too because there's kind of a truism in spirits where it's like, oh, it's not just about the product, right? It's about the storytelling and the sort of transportive element of either consuming the product or visiting the distillery. And I felt like the whiskey prison in particular almost took that to like a new level where there are people coming who have maybe more interest in like ghosts than whiskey necessarily, but that here's this opportunity for them to experience that.
The owner, Thomas, I think, has done something really smart, where he's broken it into two different tours you can take. And
Hmm.
so people are definitely leaving happy either way. There's a
Hmm.
history tour, and then there's a ghost tour. But both of the tours end in the tasting room with a tasting. And so whichever somebody comes for, also separate from that, he has a whiskey driven tour too. So he actually has three. He wanted to make sure that people were getting what they wanted out of that experience. But
Hmm.
all three of the tours are a doorway to try the spirits he's making, which he has gone out of his way to tie the aging process to the actual historic building in a really interesting ways. Yeah.
Hmm. Like, is he aging them in tell me more about that.
Well, he's aging some of the specialty products, like in the hole, where like they would put people in solitary confinement,
Mhm.
and some of the special cells, he's using those spaces to do particular aging products. But all everything's aged within the prison in former dormitories and things like that. So, and he's it amounts to a really interesting setting to age whiskey in, but he's making sure that the North Carolina atmosphere is still very much part of the aging process too. So it's kind of a twofer, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it's when you first like suggested this story and then when you filed it, part of me was a little bit surprised. I mean, kind of I was of two minds, right? Part of me was like, of course, whiskey and crime or spirits and crime have had this long history together, right? They're sort of been intertwined for as long as distilling has been a thing, basically. But
In
then also,
Ireland and Scotland as well, yeah.
what's that?
In Ireland and Scotland too, yeah.
Right. Right. I mean, it's kind of like as soon as commercial distilling became a thing, crime emerged with it, right? Sort of throughout all of this time. But then also part of me was like a little surprised that some of these, that they were leaning so heavily into these kind of like pretty dark histories for both of these businesses. You know, it's like, did it feel like, did that surprise you that they were really willing to kind of go there for with both of these producers?
It surprised me in so much as it might not be an intuitive move for a lot of small business owners, but it didn't surprise me if I put on my other hat in my day job as an 18-year crime reporter. I know how the public and I know how readerships respond to dark stories, including dark historic pieces and historic crimes as well, whether you're writing about a really upsetting, sort of harrowing crime in the present, or whether you've done the work and the research to do things like Eric Larson does and write about that in a really three-dimensional way, but in the past. Either way, there's a huge readership and a huge interest in those kind of stories. So I just think both of those individuals thought out of the box, but they were tapping into kind of a proven track record of interest. So it might not have been an intuitive thing to do for a lot of small business owners starting out, but I think if they were taking a step back and really looking at what pop culture and modern culture are interested in right now, I think it was a really smart move.
For like a distillery owner or a brand owner who maybe doesn't have a criminal history, right? Or isn't linked to a building or place or a story with a link to some sort of scintillating criminal component. Is there anything to learn from that kind of success? Is there something about embracing sort of an authentic story or being willing to kind of go out on a limb with your story that's like relevant to other producers, you think?
Yeah, I think generally embracing culture is a really good idea. You know, it's funny, ever since I got into writing about whiskey, what makes it different in some ways than writing about wine or beer is there's this really pressing question that comes up all the time when you're writing about whiskey and bourbon, and that is it science? Is it magic? Is it alchemy? But everyone agrees it's culture. So you get a lot of different answers about those other things, but everybody agrees it's culture and its history. So while the two stories here are pretty extreme in the sense that Stoney's father was almost certainly the worst killer in the history of Georgia and a whiskey maker, and the whiskey prison had many people sentenced for crimes in it and died in that prison, or and tied, whether tied to prohibition or whether tied to just North Carolina penal system all the way into like the late 1980s. There's a lot of suffering that went on in that building, and they're embracing that in the tour. So yeah, those are really extreme examples, but I do think any craft distiller who can identify some piece of culture, some sense of culture around their place, a sense of place, right, where they are, and can find a way to use storytelling about around that as a way of relating what they're trying to do and what they're trying to bring to the culture. So it's kind of like in my view, it would be like tying their contribution to culture through their spirit making to the broader history of the place that they make it in. So I do think there's a lesson for many craft distillers here, even if they don't have something as extreme as a chilling history right where they are, or some ghost story or local lore right where they are. There's probably still a good chance that there's interesting history in the area, and that what they're doing creatively is some kind of contribution to the broader history of the place and the culture of the place.
Yeah. You mentioned in your story, you know, that for is Red Clay Distilling is the name that he's mostly using right now. I couldn't
Hmm.
tell. That he's had people come in from all over the world, right? From Canada, from Sweden, from Zimbabwe. I mean, he is truly like attracting people who go far beyond sort of the average person that walks through a craft distillery's doors on a day-to-day basis.
Hmm.
Can you put that, like, that's pretty amazing. Did he tell you anything about like how many people he was seeing on a regular basis, or
Well,
but let's put that on context.
so the distilleries moved a couple times, and there's a whole story behind that too, which is really funny. He uses the story of his legal dispute over the first location as proof that he's not like his father. In he has a really interesting quote in the story about that. But when it opened in its first location in Winder, Georgia, which is where his father was based as the lead enforcer for the Dixie Mafia for his whole life, he was getting constant traffic from what he and his son described. I think it's worth mentioning that the podcast has been downloaded at least 60 million times around the world. So if only 1% of the listeners made the trip there, it would still be it has been a ton of people. The other thing is you can kind of tell by listening to the podcast, and you can kind of tell by the way Sean tells the story, that at least when the distillery opened, Stoney himself, who's the main character of this documentary, is there every day. And if he's not, his son is, who's also really important to the documentary. So people who were obsessed with the podcast had a surefire chance to meet one or both of them if they went to the distillery. That's really
Mhm.
important to think about.
Yeah.
You weren't really gambling that you were going to get some employee that couldn't get a hold of them or have them come down and meet you and shake your hand. And so I think it's really important to know that sort of came through the podcast, at least in those early days, like they were going to be there. He moved locations nearby. People were just, without doing much social media or marketing or anything, people just found him there and were coming there. He started doing events all around northern Georgia, and he was getting huge attendance for these events. So yeah, it's the power of that particular story, how it resonates with people. And if you haven't heard In the Red Clay, I have to stress that while it is a really hard and upsetting story that it's telling about crime and murders and organized crime, ultimately is a story about a father-son relationship. And it's ultimately a story about one of the worst killers trying to reform himself at the end of his life. So it ends on as uplifting as a note as the story could end on,
Mhm.
given everything that happened. And so I think that's another reason it connected with so many people. Stoney talks about people coming in and visiting him from different states who had family members with them that reconnected over the podcast. And he said that was just the most mind blowing thing. That was the most emotional part of the experience for him.
Mhm.
And he got emotional talking to me about it, like to know that he put his heart on his sleeve about his relationship with his infamous father. And he would come to meet strangers who'd reconnected over something about that father-son story, something about that redemption story connected with them in their own lives. And so much so that they went and sought him out to meet him in person, which I thought was really, really interesting. I wasn't surprised at having heard the documentary and having made documentaries myself, but I know the power of them. I was surprised how honest he was about how it affected him personally.
Mhm. Mhm. And it sounds like he was able to kind of, I mean, it sounds like it's impossible for me to know whether he knew doing that podcast that it was gonna be such a big deal, that so many people were going to hear it, right? Like, that might have been a surprise. And then it sounds like he was both able and willing to kind of, like, meet that response when it arrived, when there were people kind of coming out of the woodwork who maybe had like this parasocial relationship with him because they'd listened to this podcast, and then there they show up at his distillery, wanting to visit and talk and experience that. It sounds like he was able to say, yeah, let's open the doors and make it happen.
Well, Stoney'd be the first one to tell you he didn't know what a podcast was when Sean pitched the project to him. And so, I mean, there's no way he knew what he was getting into,
Totally.
but he was convinced that Sean was going to be fair with him
Hmm.
because his father is so notorious in Georgia history, and the press coverage of his father in the 1970s was as bad as any press coverage could be, for obvious reasons. But he was convinced that Sean would let him tell their whole family story and tell it in a way that felt organic to him as he experienced it growing up.
Mm-hmm.
But he did not know what he was getting into in terms of how far the reach of that podcast was going to be.
Mm-hmm.
I doubt Sean knew. As anyone who's made podcasts can tell you, you kind of throw it out into outer space and have no idea what's going to come back, But Stoney is his whole life been a really gregarious, really social person who loves people, who loves to talk to people. He's a natural born storyteller. Even if he didn't have this in his past, I think he would be some kind of storyteller. That's just intrinsic to his personality. So I think he just has the kind of mindset that made him able to rise to that moment without thinking much about it. And also just Southern hospitality, Southern culture. Anyone who's been in the deep South and small businesses, it's just very warm, conversational kind of vibe in a lot of small businesses in Georgia and Louisiana and places like that.
What can you tell us about what we're drinking here now that I've had a little bit? This Conviction straight bourbon whiskey, Sebastian's Pick Single Barrel Select.
Yeah, so this is the flagship bourbon of the whiskey prison. They have a whole portfolio of bourbons they're doing. They go for a really traditional style of making whiskey, making bourbon, and there's no frills, there's no gimmicks. They're trying to do just a very straightforward, roots-based take on Southern whiskey. And yeah, and I really like it. They have like I said earlier, they have this whole way of aging it inside the prison that would have unique effects on the finished product. But it's just something they kind of stumbled into, and they're getting to make whiskey that seems really popular in the region and really popular in the state. They're finding all these people to try the whiskey through this incredibly unique doorway.
Yeah. Super cool. Anything else about this story, working on the story, that kind of like surprised you, or anything cool that didn't make it into the story? Or
Oh man, well, I mean, both Mr. Thacker and Mr. Burt are super fun people to talk to. They're both great storytellers. They're both really funny. They're both very modest, in terms of their success. And I could have if we had more space, I could have put a ton of more quotes and little anecdotes and jokes from them that would have, just showed you kind of what they're like to talk to. But part of doing magazine work is, you work on word counts. So
totally. Yes. Well, and that, there is a connection there between making whiskey and loving a good story. I feel like those are very connected activities. So.
yeah, and at the whiskey prison, another thing the founding distillers really put a lot of energy into is calibrating those tours to be good. Because all over the country right now, in almost every city you go to, you can take a ghost tour. I take them all the time when I travel because they're a really fun way to learn the local lore of a place and see some historic buildings and meet a local who can also tell you where to have dinner and can also tell you where the good brewery is, and you know can also tell you what parks and beaches you might not know about. So regardless of whether people believe in paranormal things or not, ghost tours are really fun. I've got friends that come with me, and whether they actually believe any of the lore or not, they like the lore, they like the legend. So there's ghost tours happening all over the country. I think I've taken like 25 of them in different
What?
cities and in countries. So he knew that at the whiskey prison, and rather than just say, I'm going to rely on this building to do all the work for me, they actually put a lot of research and really curated what he thinks is a solid tour, that's going to match or meet or exceed people's expectations. And I think that's reflected if you go read the reviews. Again, like you can see from online reviews, people are really enjoying going there.
That's such a good point, that because you're right. I haven't been on a ghost tour in probably 15 years. But even if you don't believe in the actual ghost story, they're always linked to some historic component of the place, right? It's like this person ran a brothel during the gold rush, and this terrible tragedy took place there, and now it's haunted by prostitutes or whatever. And you're like, do I believe that it's haunted by prostitutes? Maybe not. But it's an interesting window into like a little chapter in history that you would not get otherwise.
And the lore can tell you a lot about the culture of the place too. And
Totally.
I had an epiphany about this taking a ghost tour in Venice, Italy.
Wow, that would be a good place to take a ghost tour.
It's very interesting because
Yeah.
I grew up in the California gold country, and I'm used to a certain kind of ghost story that's common in the California gold country or the Nevada silver strike country. Like there's a certain kind of, like you said, minor bordello kind of, old rancher kind of cowboy kind of ghost story. And when I've taken them on the East Coast, it's a little different. When I've taken them in the deep South, it's a little different. New Orleans is its whole own thing with stories. But in Venice, Italy, all of their ghost stories were like, I've never heard stories like that before, ever. Like they were all about making sure people were perpetually punished for all of eternity for some transgression they did.
Wow.
And you
Very
have
Dante.
yes, and you theoretically have the ability to help this ghost if you see him, but it's completely forbidden by the locals because they want them to
What?
pay, so like don't help
Yeah.
them out. Like we'll
Yes.
tell you the story, but don't help this
Yeah.
ghost out if you see him because they haven't done their penance for, so that was a really eye-opening experience for you can find out so much about how a culture thinks about its past and its religion and its overall identity as a city by some of these stories too.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, Seattle. I grew up in like Seattle area and Southeast Alaska, and there's also a lot of gold minery sorts of ghost stories there, but that's pretty much it. The more Catholic approach is unfamiliar to me.
Yeah, you get sea tales, like ghost story sea tales out there.
Yeah, just ghost ship stuff, there's some of that. And like those, in Portland, you can do a tour of the Shanghai tunnels where, there were people used to get shanghaied, right? You'd get drunk at a bar downtown and wake up on a boat,
Yeah.
30 miles out into the Pacific because you'd been shanghaied on a ship. So, yeah. Cool. Anything else? Any last thoughts or takeaways or stuff that's made you think of I should have asked about?
No, just that, the craft distillers who want to think about new ways to introduce their products should just really step back and kind of do a little research on the history of their area and just kind of contemplate. I don't think they should do anything that's forced, but if they can find an organic way to relate what they're doing to the history and culture of a place, I think it's probably a win-win, I definitely don't think they'll lose anything from it. I mean, it can only help.